Okay, so we are starting to talk about different ecosystems in the ocean, and the first ecosystem that we're going to talk about is the intertidal zone. Okay, so that's the zone that gets covered and uncovered by the tides every day. Okay, and this is a little bit of a poem or something like that from Rodgers and Hammerstein, talking about going to the tide pools. Okay, and so they say it's nothing at all when the tide is high. It's just a bunch of waves. They whip all around the rocks and chase all the fish into caves. But if you get there when the tide is low and the pool is clear and clean, you can see to the bottom the blank collection of creeps you ever seen. Okay, so talking about tide pools and going to the intertidal zone, which is one of our first ecosystems we will be talking about. So this cycle, we'll be talking about two types of ecosystems. We'll be talking about the intertidal zone, and then we'll also be talking about estuaries. Okay, where land meets the ocean, that is called the intertidal zone. Where you have fresh water, like rivers and streams and stuff running into the water, that is called an estuary. So where the river meets the sea, that's an estuary. Okay, so where rivers run into the ocean. Okay, it's an estuary. And then land and ocean is intertidal. So we're first going to look at the intertidal zone. So the borders of the intertidal zone. The upper border of the intertidal zone is the part of the land that is covered by the highest of the high tides. So the highest that the tide ever comes up, that would be considered to be the highest border of the intertidal zone. The lower border is what's exposed to the air on the lowest low tide. Okay, and so in between there, that would be the intertidal zone. One of the main characteristics of this ecosystem is that it gets exposed to the air on a regular basis, right? So if you remember from first semester, what are the three tidal patterns that you can be found worldwide? So you have neap and spring tides, but those are related to like the pull of the moon and stuff like that. But what are the actual like tidal patterns? Like remember like the waves and stuff? Diurnal, semi-diurnal, and mixed semi-diurnal. Okay, good. Diurnal, how many highs and lows does it have every 24 hours? Diurnal, one high and one low every 24 hours, right? How about semi-diurnal, how many? Two, right? And are they equal or unequal? Equal, good. So two highs, two lows. And then mixed semi-diurnal? Two, and they're unequal heights. So depending on where the land is on Earth, okay, this intertidal zone will either be exposed to the air one time a day, right, and then covered, okay, or it'll be exposed to the air twice a day, okay, and the same amount of the beach will be exposed, or it'll be exposed twice a day, but different amounts of the beach will be exposed. Does that make sense? Okay, so based on the tidal patterns, it'll determine how much air exposure that beach actually gets. Yeah? Okay. So this is Cabrillo National Monument in San Diego, and so you can see this is high tide, right? So here's the water covering that area, and then low tide, and so you can see what gets exposed during low tide. Okay? So this air exposure is actually one of the, well, is the main intertidal stressor. So what does that mean? That means that it causes hardship for animals that live in the intertidal zone. So we are talking about marine animals because we're talking about marine biology, and typically marine animals live in the water. So if marine animals get exposed to the air, it's going to be very stressful for them. So animals that live here have to be able to deal with a bunch of different things that animals that live perpetually in the ocean don't have to deal with. For example, when they get exposed to the air, they have to be able to deal with way more temperature changes than an animal that lives in the water does. Why? Well, you remember last semester when we talked about the specific heat of water, right? And like how water has a high specific heat. Do you remember that? What does that mean? Water has a high specific heat. Okay, can tolerate high heats. Good. So yeah, exactly. So it'll take lots of energy to change the temperature of the water, right? So water pretty much has a fairly constant water temperature. Air does not have a high specific heat, okay? And so during the day, you know, it could be 90 degrees outside at the beach, and then at night it could be 50 or lower, just depends, okay? So if you're an animal that's living in the intertidal zone and it's low tide during the day, you could be exposed to 90-degree heat. But if you're at night and it's low tide, you could be exposed to 50 degrees, okay? So there's a wide variety of temperatures that these animals have to be able to deal with. And they've got all sorts of adaptations that allow for them to deal with these wide-ranging temperatures. And also, once they get back covered with water, then they'll be whatever temperature the water is, too, right? So, I mean, the temperature can fluctuate a lot in 24 hours for these animals. Also, salinity changes and tide pools. So, when the water goes out, some of the water gets caught in rocks, and you have animals that will live in these tide pools. And you remember, again, last semester, this was like first semester review. Okay, you remember last semester, if you have like a tide pool and it's sunny outside, what happens to the water in the tide pool? It becomes more salty, right? So what happens to the animals that are in there? Hypertonic. Yeah, it's hypertonic to the animals, so the water goes out of the animal's cells, right? What happens if it's a rainy day? Less salty. So it's hypotonic, so the water tends to go into the animal's cells, right? So animals that live in these tide pools have to be able to deal with these salinity changes as well, okay? Whereas if they're constantly in the ocean, that doesn't happen, right? So salinity changes poses a problem. Drying out, okay, aka desiccation. You will hear this term, desiccation, for the rest of the semester. Please know what it means. If you ask me on your test, oh, what does desiccation mean? I'll be like, I can't tell you. You should know that. Okay, so desiccation means drying out. Okay, so animals that live in the intertidal zone used to be covered in water. Now they're exposed to the air. They're going to dry out. Okay, and that can cause lots of problems. And they actually have lots of methods and adaptations to try and hold on to water and keep themselves from drying out. They're also exposed to predation when the tide is out, because when the tide is out, animals from land can walk out into the intertidal zone and eat the animals that are there. And then when the tide comes in, animals from the ocean can come in and eat from the intertidal zone. So they kind of get a double whammy of predation, right? So it's a hard place to live if you're a marine animal. Waves also cause problems for animals. You remember last semester when we talked about waves? What do waves carry from the open ocean to the shore? Energy. Good. Energy. And then when the wave crashes, all of that energy gets expended on the shore, right? So all of these waves are crashing on the shore where these animals live, okay? And if those waves are carrying anything with it, like a log or something like that, it can crush the animals that are there, okay? And, I mean, they're constantly getting pounded by these waves, right? And then when the water goes back out, okay, it, like, tries to drag stuff with it. Have you ever stood, like, on the sand on the beach and then, like, tried to like, brace yourself, and then the water goes out and, like, moves, and you're like, whoa, yeah, okay? Yeah, so that drag as the water goes back out is trying to pull the animals, like, off their rocks and pull them back out to sea. They don't want to do that because they would die. So that would be bad. So they have to deal with the waves crashing and then also trying to pull them out to sea. So it's hard for these creatures. Here's some adaptations that they have to deal with these stressful things, like the air exposure and the waves. Pretty much the main way that they have to deal with this problem, particularly of air exposure, is location, location, location. So just like in real estate, location, location, location are the three most important things. So it is for animals in the intertidal zone, right? Because the distance that the animal is from the water will actually determine the amount of stress that it's under. Okay, so let me show you. Whoa. Okay, we'll come back to that. So here's our land, here's our water, right? If this is the intertidal zone, okay, the water. Okay, when the tide is high, okay, when the tide comes in, this upper part of the intertidal up here is the last part that gets covered, right, by the tide. And then when the tide goes out, it's the first thing that gets uncovered. Okay, so animals that live up here are going to be exposed to more air for longer than animals that live down here. Does that make sense? Okay, so the location of those animals in the intertidal zone is very, very important. If they grow or start attached too far up in the intertidal zone, then they die because they can't survive that amount of air exposure. Okay, so location, location, location. They'll also seek out like cracks or like overhangs of rocks because those areas tend to stay cooler, wetter, and can also reduce the amount of stress that the animal's under. So they'll look for any little caves, overhangs, cracks. That's why when you go to the tide pools, if you see like a rock or something that's small enough for you to like turn over, if you turn it over, you'll probably find some animals underneath there, right? So that also means that once you look at the cool animals, you turn the rock back over because that's where they need to be to survive low tide, okay? But these areas will help to reduce stress. Also, a lot of animals, you'll find them under algae. So they'll go under like the seagrass or the algae to try and protect themselves from the heat from the sun and stuff like that. Another thing that they have to try and do is keep cool. So when they're exposed to the sun, and they've got several ways to do that. One of the ways that they'll do that is try and like store water in their bodies, because again, water has a high specific heat, so it'll help to, keep their body temperature cooler. That's why like you'll see like anemones at the shore, they kind of like curl in on themselves during low tide, right? And if you poke them, they squirt water. Okay, what they're doing is they're curling in on themselves so that they can keep water inside their bodies to try and stay cool and moist during low tide. They also attach like the bits of shells and stuff on their outside to try and like reflect some of that heat away. So when you squish them, it's fun to like squish them and see them squirt water, but it's actually like life-threatening for that anemone. Okay, because if they can't maintain that certain temperature and that certain amount of water in their bodies, they die. So it's fun to squish anemones, but don't do it. Okay. They also try and reflect light. So you have like limpets and snails and stuff that in the tropics will be like have like white shells. Okay. Whereas the same kind of limpet in Maine has like a dark shell. Okay. Because in the tropics, white helps to reflect light and to keep you cooler. Up in Maine, it gets pretty cold, right? And so the dark shell helps to absorb heat. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. For wave issues, they'll try and like have a strong anchor, so you'll see like mussels have these byssal threads that like hold onto the rocks for them. Mollusks and stuff that live in areas where there's lots of wave action, they actually have bigger feet, okay, than other mollusks, same mollusks in a low wave area, because that big foot helps them to suction onto the rocks and hold on better. And if it's an algae, they'll have a big strong hold fast. Okay. And then they also try and have like a lower profile, so they'll be like closer to the rock to try and reduce drag. Make sense? Okay. So there's two types of intertidal zones. You have the rocky intertidal zone, and then you have the sandy intertidal zone. Rocky is when the land is rocks and it meets the ocean. Sandy is like the beach, right? So rocky intertidal, we're going to talk about first. Okay, and here's just a few pictures of what it looks like. Okay, so if you ever go to the rocky intertidal zone, you may notice that there are actually like bands in the rocky intertidal zone. And the bands are formed from animals. They're formed from animals. So different amounts or different types of animals can withstand different amounts of air exposure. So they will be found in certain areas of the intertidal. And those animals tend to have a certain color. So you get like these bands of color in the intertidal zone because of the animals and the color that they are. There's 5 zones. Okay, you have the splash zone, the upper, middle, lower intertidal, and then the subtidal. Your book will use like these terms, the supralittoral fringe, upper mid-littoral, okay, and like these terms, they're super confusing, okay? Like, I don't even know all these terms specifically, so I use these terms. These are all you need to know, okay? Because it's like upper mid-littoral, what? Like, okay. Middle and low mid-littoral, huh? Like, okay, whatever. So splash, upper, middle, low, subtitle. Yeah. Whoa. So this upper zone is called the splash zone. And the splash zone is very, very rarely going to ever be underwater. This would be the zone that is only covered by the highest of the high tides. So most every other day, it will be exposed to the air. And it's called the splash zone because the majority of the water that this area gets is from when the waves crash and it sprays. That's how the animals get their water. Okay, so it's very, very rare that it's actually ever underwater. Types of animals that you find in this area, okay, are going to be these little snails, okay, and Pteramorpha, that's actually that green algae that's in the picture, okay, and then you also get these small brownish gray barnacles, bless you, okay, that live up here as well. So they're like the little ones, the ones. And then lichen. Do you guys remember what lichen are from like freshman bio or 8th grade science, sort of? It's a mutualistic relationship between fungi and algae. Remember that? So it's a fungus and an algae living together. And so lichen are found up here in the stone. So that's up here. Okay, that's the splash zone. Highest zone. The high intertidal zone. Okay, this is going to be the zone that is exposed during each low tide. Okay, so this is going to be this upper part right here. Okay, and so every low tide, that's going to get exposed to the air. And it's going to be the last thing to be covered. Okay, types of things that you find here are acorn barnacles. That's this picture right here. Shore crabs. Okay, limpets. Okay, that sort of thing. That's this zone right here. Okay. Okay. Barnacles. Lots of barnacles. The middle intertidal zone. So the middle intertidal zone is only exposed to the air for part of each low tide. Okay, it's exposed after the high intertidal, and it gets covered before the high intertidal. Types of things that you find here: mussels, aggregating anemones, and rockweed. Rockweed is this algae right here. Okay, so this picture right here on the right is trying to show you the actual kind of like bands. It's hard on the smart board. It's more obvious on my computer. But you can see right here, this is actually the high intertidal zone. It's kind of like a lighter color. You see that? Because it's the barnacles, right? The barnacles have a lighter color. Then below that, see how it gets darker? Okay, that's all of the mussels, and then the anemones are down here. Okay, so you have the high intertidal, the middle intertidal. Okay. And then the low intertidal zone, that's the one that's very rarely exposed. That's the one that gets exposed during negative spring tides. That's when you want to go to the tide pools because the zone gets exposed, and so lots of things that normally aren't exposed you can see, okay? Which is why we want to go during a negative spring tide, right? And types of animals that you find here: sea stars, okay? So sea stars, and the bigger green anemones, and then like kelp and surf grass and stuff. And so that's going to be down here. All right. After the low intertidal zone, you have the subtidal zone. That's like considered to be like the edge of the intertidal. It's always underwater, never gets exposed. You could even say it's like the beginning of the neritic zone, okay, because all of the other habitats that we talk about are underwater all the time. Okay, so it's always underwater. Things that you find here, these are where you find most of the fish, mammals that we've been talking about, right? Lots of the crustaceans and other mollusks and stuff like that. Okay, so and the big algae like the kelp. Okay? So that's the subtidal zone. So how do we actually maintain these zones in the intertidal and so that we can go there and actually see them? They're actually maintained by two things. The upper limit of the zone is maintained by physiology, so by how well an animal can deal with the amount of air exposure. So if you're an animal that can deal with more air exposure, you can be found higher in the intertidal zone. Okay, and so you'll find, that's why you find like barnacles higher in the intertidal zone, because they can withstand more air exposure. But after a certain point, if they settle on the rocks, it's too much air exposure, and so they die. So that upper limit of where those barnacles can be found is determined by how much air exposure they can withstand. Does that make sense? The lower limit is determined by biological interactions like competition for space or predation. All right? So, for example, mussels found in the middle intertidal zone, right? Mussels are really good at competing for space, and they would actually like take over the rest of the intertidal zone if they were allowed to. Okay, so they have their upper limit set by how far out of water they can be for how long, but below that they could just take over. Okay, their lower limit though is set by their predators, sea stars. Okay, so sea stars love mussels, their favorite food, and so sea stars eat the mussels, and they keep the mussels in this middle intertidal zone. Okay, prevent them from taking over down lower in the intertidal zone. And then that upper limit is set by their ability to withstand air exposure. Does that make sense? Okay. And the same kind of thing occurs like with the barnacles. Barnacles are found higher, okay, because they can withstand more air exposure, but they're not found lower because the mussels outcompete them. All right? So that's how you maintain zones. Tide pools kind of mess up that zonation because they hold on to water during low tide and allow for things to be found higher in the intertidal zone than they normally would be. Okay. So we've gone to the tide pools, and 2 of the 5 years we've gone, we've actually found octopus. And like last year, we found a huge octopus. Brian Lee caught like this giant octopus. Well, it's not giant, but it was like this big. It's a big octopus to catch in the intertidal zone. So it was kind of awesome. You can see there's different sizes of tide pools, right? And again, obvious, but if you have a bigger tide pool, more animals can live there. Smaller, fewer. Okay. Yeah, makes sense? All right. So the sea star, the ochre star, is actually a keystone species in the rocky intertidal zone because it keeps mussels in its place, in their place. And it only takes a few sea stars to have a big impact. All right? Okay. So these are just some pictures to help you see this. So you can see like sea stars and mussels, right? These are actually the same 3 pictures that you saw at the beginning of the year, right? When we talked about the scientific method and we were doing our experiment to see if sea stars eat mussels, yeah? The very first cycle. Okay, so yeah, sea stars eat mussels. All right. Okay, so that's the rocky intertidal zone. Sandy intertidal. The sandy intertidal is a very different habitat from the rocky intertidal. One of the main differences that you'll see is that in the sandy intertidal, you don't see animals on the surface, right? You don't go to the beach and just see like these zones of animals. And that's because the top layer of sand is very, very unstable. So, and you can probably tell that, it's pretty obvious if you like stand in the water like we were talking about, and sand moves as you just stand there, right? So the sand is very unstable at the surface, and there's nothing to attach to. So you don't really find animals at the surface. Whereas in the rocky intertidal zone, it's kind of hard to dig into rock. So animals attached to a surface, so you see them on the surface. Okay, so the top layer is very unstable in the sandy intertidal, and the size of the grain of sand will actually determine a lot about the ecosystem that you find at the sandy intertidal. So, and that the size of the grain of sand can also tell you a lot about the wave activity on that beach. Okay, so if you go to a beach, how many of you have ever gone to a beach that's just like pebbles? It's not actually sand, right? It's like hard to walk on there. Yeah, it's not as much fun to go to. Okay, but you've got pebbles, right? A beach that has pebbles rather than like finer sand, that tells you that that beach has a lot of wave action. So what happens is as the waves crash, okay, there's lots of like turbulence and stuff, and so the only thing that has time to like settle out of the water as it like crashes and then recedes would be like the larger things, like the pebbles. Okay, so if that was being carried by the water, those are the only things that would have time to settle out. All of the like finer pieces of sand that it would be carrying, because there's so much wave action, those don't have time to like trickle down to the bottom. Okay, so those beaches that have the big rocks, more wave action. Okay, when you have big rocks, okay, when the tide goes out, they're like those big rocks don't really hold water very well, right? It just kind of like trickles through, goes away. Okay, so those beaches are very hard for things to live in. A, because when the waves crash, they move the pebbles and you're likely to get crushed. And then B, they don't hold on to water very well, so it's hard for animals to live there. Does that make sense? Okay, if you go to a beach where there's like sand, like Zuma, okay, or something like that, that tells you that the wave action there is less. Okay, so more of the sand has had time to settle out, okay, because there's less wave action, and so more of those things can settle out. If you have a beach that has finer particles of sand, that means that water doesn't trickle through as well. Some of the water gets caught from the capillary action, oh dear, from last semester, of water, and it holds on to water better. And so A, they're not going to get crushed between rocks. B, there's water that gets held onto in the sand, and so things can live there and survive there all the time. Yes, makes sense? Okay. So here's some pictures to help you see. It's hard to see on here, but rocky, sandy intertidal, and then like Ventura, right? Okay, so you actually have zonation in sandy beaches as well, believe it or not. And that zonation is going to be determined by the strength of the waves. You have two kinds of zonation. You have horizontal zonation and you have vertical zonation. Horizontal zonation, okay, is like this. So you have the subtidal zone, okay, you have the middle, and then you have the upper or the high intertidal, right? So this is like towards the water, away from the water. And as you move up the beach, this is the zonation that you get, okay? The subtidal, you're going to have things like these big moon snails and sand dollars and like hermit crabs. Middle intertidal, you'll have things like clams and like things like sand crabs, that's what I'm thinking of. Sand crabs and worms. And higher, you're going to have like other types of isopods, like the little like fleas and stuff like that that jump around. Okay? So that's your zonation. So if you're digging and you can find sand crabs, you're probably in the middle intertidal zone of the sandy beach. In that middle beach, you actually have vertical zones as well. So vertical zones. That very top layer, like we talked about, very unstable. You're not going to find too much in it. And that top layer of sand we call the drier drying sand. So how many of you have ever been to the beach and you're like, I'm going to dig a hole, right? And so you start digging your hole, and at first, you know, it's like you're digging through dry sand, right? Or it's not really wet, okay? So that top layer that you're going through is the drier drying sand zone. After you dig down a little bit, you may get to damp sand, right? So damp sand is our moisture retention zone, okay? That's our damp sand. You're going to find all sorts of like crustaceans, like isopods and stuff like that in your damp sand zone. If you keep going, okay, you're going to get to wet sand, right? Keep digging. That wet sand is the water retention zone, Okay, you're going to have things like worms and stuff that can live in there. You keep going. How many of you have ever gotten to the point where now there's like liquid water at the bottom of your hole? Okay, yeah, and you're like, it's now impossible for me to dig any deeper because it just collapses back in on itself, and it's super frustrating, right? I always wanted to dig to check. The water saturation, that's the water saturation zone. Okay, that's the deepest part. That's where you get liquid water that remains all the time. Okay, so that's where you're going to find like worms and also clams and stuff like that. All right, does that make sense? Okay, so you have the horizontal and the vertical zonation of the sandy intertidal zone. Okay, we're going to stop there.